All right, now we've kind of come to the end of the large, vast amount of theoretical work that's been done in criminology. And this is an introductory class, so what you've learned in this third of the class is really scratching the surface of the theoretical ideas that have been researched and written about in this field. The final really area and something that some people would argue is going to be much more prevalent in the future of criminology is people doing work in developing criminal typologies as opposed to developing kind of traditional theories of criminal behavior. So people who develop criminal typologies and who believe in classifying criminal behavior this way are much more interested in classifying types of crime and types of criminals instead of understanding criminal behavior from kind of a theoretical standpoint. Instead of modeling behavior over time, coming up with kind of prototypes of typical crimes, typical elements of certain types of crimes, and typical criminals who commit those types of crimes. So it's typologies because you're focusing much more on the crime type and getting a really in-depth understanding of how that particular type of crime develops and the type of people that tend to do it. So in criminal typologies, which are going to be the majority of the rest of our course, we're going to focus on variables and elements of types of crime and not theoretical explanations as to why they come about. So in other words, the kind of questions that we're going to be answering for the rest of this class are looking at specific types of crime, things like violent crime, organized crime, drug crime, public order crime. You're going to look at those types of crimes, you're going to get a deeper understanding of exactly what it means to be committing them, and we're going to look at what variables tend to be related to that kind of criminal behavior and in what ways. What demographic characteristics, what lifestyle characteristics. It's a really useful way. Criminologists like getting an understanding of typologies because it's a useful way to make sense of often the very complex way in which some of these criminal behaviors come about. You know, a lot of the theories that we've been talking about in this class, they kind of consider most criminal behavior to be taken as essentially equal, right? If you think back to some of the traditional theories, they describe background factors which lead to one main thing happening and that causes crime. But doesn't ever really do that much to distinguish between types of crime. And generally, that is what criminal typologists like to do, is they like to focus much more on the crime type and classify by the crime type than they do classifying it on the underlying behavioral process. So in this class, what you're going to see over the next third of the class is we're going to really break down things like violent crime and things like property crime and try to understand them kind of as their own unique category, their own unique element. Now, there are some criticisms of understanding criminal behavior this way. There are some criticisms of approaching an understanding of criminal behavior from a typological standpoint. A couple of the criticisms that that are out there is not everyone really agrees that we should come up with kind of a prototypical example or understanding of different crime types because types of crime really vary over time and place. So, if you get an understanding for what your prototypical robbery is, does that really tell you anything about the broad spectrum of how robberies tend to happen? If you get a prototypical sexual offender, does that really explain the entire spectrum of that behavior? So that's kind of one criticism of understanding crime from a typological standpoint. Another, probably really big criticism of this is it tends to, as you'll see throughout this class, it tends to kind of break down criminal behavior into these categories, assuming that offenders specialize in those different types of criminal behavior. So you'll see when we get into, for example, street and property, violent and property crimes, it talks about a typical property crime offender. And that's fine, except one thing that we know about offending and people who commit crime is they often really don't specialize. People who rob liquor stores don't just do that. They often dabble in many different types of crime. So understanding crime from a typological standpoint and how that kind of behavior develops is fine, but one criticism people have is, you're missing out on the fact that offenders dabble in many different types of criminal behavior. Another criticism of it comes from the proponents of studying criminal careers. So if you remember back to the day when we talked about, the field of criminal career research, the scholars who believe that studying a criminal career is important, they believe in studying how someone's criminal behavior changes over their life course. And if you're just studying crime typologies, you're not really getting a really clear understanding of what kind of crimes tend to fall in what part of a person's life. You're kind of oversimplifying a person's criminal career by just focusing on one type of crime that they commit. And another criticism of understanding crime from a typological standpoint is it tends to place a lot of it tends to really separate out these crimes and talk about it really minimizes how similar some of these crime types are by breaking them down and studying them so specifically. So understanding, public order offending and differentiating it really specifically from things like violent or property crime. Some people say, yes, there are differences between those two things, but it's often the same people committing those offenses. So a lot of people don't like studying crime typologies because it's minimizing the similarities among different kinds of behaviors. That being said, having one reason why this is part of your course and part of most introduction to criminology courses is not a lot of you know very specific information about violent crime, property crime, organized crime. You might be relying on stuff that you've kind of learned over time from a variety of sources, but one good thing about this course is it's going to give you some more specific knowledge and understanding of these different crime types. And what I want you to do as you go forward in this class is, learn about these crime types, but always keep the theories in the back of your mind. So, given what you know about a certain crime type, think about what the theories would say about why that criminal behavior came to be. So don't throw the theories out of your mind, but don't let that impede on you understanding and getting a deeper knowledge of each of these different types of crime. To get an idea of some of the typologies that we're going to talk about in this class, you can go to page 98 of your Hagen textbook, and you'll see that they've basically divided up criminal behavior into 9 basic types: violent, property, corporate, public order, and we're going to go through a lot of those in this class. That's what the last third of the class is going to be, going through each of those types of crime. And the types tend to be based on four basic kinds of characteristics. First of all, in terms of a criminal career, some of these crimes tend to very obviously fit in one part of a person's criminal career as opposed to another. Not everyone necessarily agrees that you can definitely say for sure where some of these would fall, but things like corporate offending, white-collar offending, those tend to fall a little bit more obviously in certain parts of a criminal career. In terms of, group support of the behavior, some of these crimes you will see tend to be things that are more obviously done in groups as opposed to individual types of behavior. And, the last two things that are written on this slide in terms of the characteristics that these are based on, in terms of criminal or legitimate behavior correspondence, essentially some of these criminal typologies fit much more obviously into a person's normal kind of lifestyle. Some of these crime typologies you can imagine kind of take over a person's lifestyle, whereas others of them are able to be done while a person engages in a by all other accounts kind of normal life. And we also tend to classify and understand these criminal behaviors by the kind of reactions that they elicit. So things like white-collar crime, things like corporate crime, cybercrime. These things have a little bit of a different societal reaction than some of your more traditional violent property offenses. And we process and handle offenders differently as such. So that's one thing that criminal typologists are very interested in understanding is what is it about our reaction to these criminal behaviors that influences how we decide to punish them. And, and this is where people start to examine why some criminal behaviors that seem to be very serious, because they are a certain type, they are a certain classification of behavior, kind of get minimized and punished much less seriously. So that's kind of some examples of things that we will talk about in this last third of the class. All right, so this is the last online lecture before your exam, and this is the last lecture where we are covering theories of crime. And I just wanted to give you some tips on how to organize your class notes for all the theories that we've discussed, because I know that we've gone through a lot of theories, and a lot of you are probably wondering, how am I going to condense this information, pull out of it the things that I need to know, the things that are most important about these theories? So I wanted to talk about that for a few minutes with you guys, because what I think would be most useful for you in terms of how to study for this exam is I want you to go through all of the different theories we've discussed. Maybe start out by going through your notes and just literally on a piece of paper writing out the names of some of the different theories that we've discussed. Once you get your study guide from me, that will probably help you also kind of organize all of these different theories. And for all of these different theories, there are going to be a couple things that I want you to make sure that you know. First of all of these theories come at their explanation from some assumption about human nature. All of them are confronting criminal behavior, assuming that something about human nature is true. And you should know those different assumptions. What does social learning say about human nature? What does it assume about human nature, and what does that say about criminal behavior? You should be able to go through most of our theories and pull out the basic assumption that we've made. You should also be able to tell me whether or not the theory is operating at a macro or a micro level. What I mean by that is the theory making some society level explanation of criminal behavior? This is why American crime is high. This is why crime in the lower classes is high. So that would be an example of a macro level theory. Something like institutional anomie, that's a macro level explanation. Merton's classic strain theory, macro level explanation. Social disorganization, that's a neighborhood level explanation for crime. That's a macro level explanation. But there are some other theories that actually try to explain between individual differences. So is how a person was raised, does that make a difference? So things like Hershey's social control theory or Gottfredson and Hershey's general theory of crime. Those are all micro level theories because they're explaining what it is about an individual that causes them to commit crime. You should also be able to identify for me the key causal factors in each of the theories. And whenever we model a theory, those are the key causal factors, the things that I put into the model. You should be able to model out these theories on your own. You should be able to draw on a blank piece of paper. If I asked you to explain social learning theory to me, you should be able to give me at least the key elements in what causes criminal behavior from each of these theories. You should also be able to tell me whether or not this theory is trying to explain crime at just one point, adolescence for example, or whether or not it's making a case that it can explain crime throughout the life course. So if you think back to what we've learned so far, some of the subcultural theories of crime, those tend to really be explaining young adolescent boy delinquency. Social disorganization, it's a neighborhood level theory, but it's really explaining youth delinquency. Contrast that with something like the general theory of crime, which claims to be able to explain crime throughout a person's life. Any of the life course developmental theories, those are theories of crime that are trying to explain criminal behavior throughout a much longer period of a person's life. So be able to tell me for each of the theories what kind of population it's trying to explain. You should also be able to tell me whether or not the criminal theory is coming from is approaching its understanding and from either a consensus or a conflict perspective. So is the theory assuming that we have come together as a society and have come into a consensus about what should and should not be considered crime? Or is the theory assuming that there are different interest groups at work? The interest group that has the most power has manipulated our legal system to keep its power. Things like labeling theory, conflict theory, radical Marxist theory, those are all conflict perspectives. Whereas most of the traditional theories of crime, things like social learning theory, general strain theory, all of those theories would be much more a consensus perspective because they're not questioning what is and is not considered criminal. And finally, is the theory an integrated theory? Is it more of a typological idea, or is it a traditional theory? And that should be pretty simple for you guys to parse out because we've really only talked about integrated theories here today. So most of the other theories that we've talked about in this class, except for Elliott and Thornberry, are traditional theories of crime. And finally, you should be able to tell me what problems or criticisms of the theory we've talked about in class. For almost all of these theories, not all of them, but for almost all of them, we've talked about some problems with the theory. None of these theories are perfect, and there have been very well-documented criticisms of a lot of these theories that we've talked about in class. So at least be able to know enough of those so that you could pick out, if I ask you a question like, all of these are criticisms of labeling theory, except you should be able to pick out which one of the things is not a criticism of it. All right, so next time we are going to, and this is still getting included onto exam 2, but next time we're going to go through the basic elements of two different crime typologies, violent and property crime, and we're approaching this from kind of a street crime perspective. And don't forget that after this class, we still have one class where we're going to do kind of an exam review. And be on the lookout for an announcement about that. But other than that, I will see you on Thursday.